Oh, and I neglected to ask, are you both okay having this webinar recorded?
Sure.
Thank you. We do find that a number of people, for whatever reason, can't make it, and it is very nice. We've been posting the webinars to our website, and I have been hearing from people who are very grateful that they can watch it afterwards, so thank you. Welcome to those of you who are early birds. It's 4:57, and we're gonna give it a few more minutes before we get started with today's program. So grab your water and your snacks and your notepad. This is gonna be a great program. It's 4:59 and we have 11 attendees. Thank you all for coming. Looking forward to this program. I like your clock, Lynn.
Yeah, it helps keep me on task sometimes. Although I feel like a late 19th century like industrialist or something, being governed by the clock.
It's very old school, but very helpful. And I'm going by your clock. It is 5 o'clock. By Lynn Fisher's clock. We're going to get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Lauren Kaufman, director of the Highland House Museum. I'm very happy to have with me Linford Fisher, professor in the history department at Brown University, and Paula Peters, Wampanoag educator and historian. I am very excited for their program today, Native Enslavement and Settler Colonialism in Early New England. Before we get started, I want to mention this is the last in a long series of webinars that we started last June. And while these virtual programs have really been wonderful, and I want to thank all of you for attending, your support has just been tremendous. I'm also excited we'll be having a few in-person programs starting a week from today. We have our first in-person program. Native storyteller Deborah Spears Moorhead will actually be coming to the museum, and we'll be giving a program outdoors in back of the Highland Links golf course. So I hope you'll all bring your lawn chairs and come to next Wednesday's program. I'm very psyched that I'll be able to see people again. Before we start, I'd like to read our land acknowledgement. The Highland House Museum stands on the traditional homelands of the Palemet tribe of the Wampanoag Nation, who have inhabited Cape Cod for more than 12,000 years and who knew this part of Truro as Tashmuit. The Truro Historical Society acknowledges the displacement, suffering, and forced assimilation of the Wampanoag and other native peoples caused by European colonization. We honor the struggles of the Wampanoag, people of the First Light. We support their work of cultural recovery, and we ask visitors to the museum to reflect on our shared responsibility for social justice. I'd like to introduce Paula Peters first. She'll be our first presenter this afternoon. Paula is a member of the Wampanoag tribe and is also an educator and activist. She has spent most of her life in her tribal homeland in Mashpee, Massachusetts. She hails from a prominent Mashpee Wampanoag family, including tribal chairman Russell Fast Turtle Peters, who was her father, and was active in the tribe's long and contested push for federal recognition. She has served on the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribal Council. Paula and her son Steve operate Smoke Signals, a company that curates exhibitions about Wampanoag history, and I am very pleased that they served on our advisory board and reviewed much of the material for our new exhibition entitled Wampanoag Nation, People of the First Light. So thank you, Paula and Steve, for your support. In addition to her writing and consulting, Paula has worked as a public educator of Native history. She served for a time as Director of Marketing and Public Relations for the Wampanoag Indian Program at Plymouth Plantation. I'm also going to tell you a little bit about Professor Linford Fisher. He grew up in the rolling hills of southeastern Pennsylvania and received his doctorate from Harvard in 2008 and joined the history department at Brown in the summer of 2009. Professor Fisher's research and teaching relate primarily to the cultural and religious history of colonial America and the Atlantic world, including Native Americans, religion, material culture, and Indian and African slavery and servitude. He is the author of The Indian Great Awakening, Religion and the Shaping of Native Cultures in Early America, and co-author of Decoding Roger Williams, the Lost Essay of Rhode Island's Founding Father. Professor Fisher is currently finishing a history of Native American enslavement in the English colonies and the United States between Columbus and the American Civil War. He's also the principal investigator of the Stolen Relations, Recovering Stories of Indigenous Enslavement in the Americas project, which seeks to create a public centralized database of Native slavery throughout the Americas and across time. So you are very privileged to have these two wonderful people here this afternoon. So I am going to hand it over to Paula, who is going to start, and then Professor Fisher will follow up.
Kutapatash, Laura, and also I want to introduce myself, Natasawis Sonkwaban, Nutamas Masapiak. This is my traditional name is Sonkwaban, and my first slide is of me, me in my traditional home of Mashpee, and I felt it was important to start here because this is where we still are. Whenever I am speaking or presenting for my people and my history, I like to remind people that we are still here. And that's the most important message that I can get across. But when we're speaking about Indigenous slavery, which is something that does not get a whole lot of attention, casual consumers of history don't know much about Indigenous slavery. They don't think about it. You think about the enslavement of African Americans for sure, but the culture of slavery, particularly in colonial times and pre-colonial times, was very real for a lot of people. And I'm gonna let Lynn talk more about that. But as it pertains really to the backstory of the Mayflower and the backstory of Plymouth Colony, I like to remind people of what happened here. It of course started with Christopher Columbus in 1492 coming over, and I'm sure Lynn will be able to talk more intelligently about that, at least from a scholarly perspective. But you know, even the little bit that I've researched about Columbus and the atrocities that were committed by his efforts to colonize in South America. It was just a horrible atrocity to the Arawak people, being forced into enslavement so that they could try and dig for gold for Columbus to make his ventures profitable. And then he found out that actually the most profitable thing were the people themselves. And by 1692, or wait a minute, 1695, I had to take my glasses off because I can't see. By 1695, he had round up at least 1,000 Arawak people to sell off into slavery in Spain, at which point he found out how profitable that was. And he said, and I quote, "Let us in the name of the Holy Trinity go on sending all the slaves that can be sold." It was just sheer greed on his part. And it was something that was followed up by explorers to this region for the next 500 years. In 1524, Giovanni da Verrazzano was exploring the region that we now know as Cape Fear. And that region could very well have gotten its name from the actions of Verrazzano himself. His party came ashore at Cape Fear, and they met with a group of native people who immediately began to run from them. They didn't trust this group of men, and the only ones that couldn't escape were an elderly woman with some small children and a younger woman. They grabbed the young woman and one of the boys and tried to drag them back to their ship. And upon doing that, I should be sharing my, upon doing that, there he is, the culprit. The young woman screamed so loudly that they did end up letting her go. But they took the boy, and they took him as a prize. We don't know what ultimately they did with him, but it was at that point in time very common for them to bring back human beings, and in this case, a small boy, to show off as a curiosity even. But it was definitely, they were not treated as people, not as human beings. By 1605, Captain George Weymouth had begun exploring this region of New England, Maine, and Massachusetts, and New Hampshire, the regions we know today as New England. And he became quite interested in capturing the indigenous men from this region and bringing them back and selling them into slavery, bringing them back also as curiosities. Some of these men were actually taken to try and get information about language, about culture, so that the explorers that were coming back to this region could have advanced information, intelligence, I guess you'd call it, on the people that lived here. Weymouth was followed by Captain Harlow, who also toured these same regions and would capture men and lure them onto his ship. He was known to lure them in kind of a farce, well, saying that they wanted to trade with them, and then they would take them below the decks and bring them back to England to sell into slavery. one of the trips in 1611, when Captain Harlow was touring this region, he took some men from Maine. He took some men also from Nantucket, and then he went to the island of Nope, which is known today as Martha's Vineyard. And there he took a man named Ipanau, who became a great leader of the people of Nope, because he was actually one of the few who was able to come back. He was taken and he lived in England. He lived with Sir Ferdinand Gorges, who was a financier of these many trips of these explorers and these pirates, really, I call them, who would go and take men away from their villages. And Ipanau, even though he didn't speak any of the language when he first arrived, he learned enough in the short time that he was there, about 3 years he was there, he learned enough to know that perhaps his ticket home was to convince Sir Ferdinando Gorges that he knew where there was gold on the island of Nope. And with the idea that he might benefit from sending Ipanau back as a guide to those caches of gold, Ipanau was able to convince them to bring him home. Once he got to the shores of Nope, he was able to communicate with his own people, who, of course, out of curiosity, came to the boat, and Ipanau was able to tell them, hey, by the way, I'm a captive and you need to help me get back home again. And of course, there was a battle that ensued, but Ipanau was able to jump the ship and swim home and be among his own people again, and did ultimately become a sachem on the island of Nope, which is Martha's Vineyard. Unfortunately, at about that same time, there was another ship that was a part of a fleet that John Smith, who was touring New England at that time, 1614, it was part of his fleet. This Captain Hunt was told to go to Patuxet and trade with the native people there and trade for some fish and return home. He thought better of it, Captain Hunt did. He thought that he would profit more from humans than he would from fish. So they did pretend to trade with these people in Patuxet, and ultimately began to kidnap them. They brought 20 men from Patuxet. They took 20 men from Patuxet, and then they went on closer to where your museum is in Nauset, and they took 7 more men. Of all of those men who were taken, there was only one who was known ultimately to return, and that was to Squantum or Squanto. He was able to come back he was kidnapped in 1614. He was able to come back in 1619 as a guide, and he was ultimately the only one left of the people of Patuxet. He'd come home to find that all of the people of Patuxet and many of the villages from Maine to the tip of Cape Cod had been wiped out in the interim. There had been a great plague that had been introduced to the region, and these tribes, in much the same way we are dealing with a worldwide pandemic, they had no cure, they had no way of treating the illness, and people were dying en masse. There were tens of thousands of people that died from the plague. So by the time Squanto returned, there really was no one. But he was here, and the story of the Mayflower becomes really the story that's taught. It's not the story of enslavement. It's not the story of the atrocities that were committed against Native people. It's not the story of the disease that was brought here and that wiped out tens of thousands of people. It's the story of these courageous pilgrims and settlers that came and colonized this region, and the happy Indian that taught them how to hunt and to fish. So that's the important backstory that I like to, or I feel like it's important to bring across to people who are wanting to learn about this region and this history. And also was, it's important for me to sort of bring that story full circle. As a journalist, some of you are familiar with me as a journalist. I spent a decade working in mainstream journalism, writing for the Cape Cod Times for many years. I had the great opportunity back in 2002 to be part of and to chronicle the reconnection of people from the Wampanoag, Narragansett, and Pequot tribes, reconnecting with the descendants of those who had been sold into slavery in Bermuda 350 years earlier. And that reconnection has endured. We still, to this day, as a matter of fact, I brought someone back, one of our cousins, 350 years removed, returned to Bermuda just yesterday. So it is a lasting and important connection that has been made from the descendants, both those of us that endure here in our ancestral homeland and those who were taken away. I'm going to pass the baton, so to speak, to Lynn, who, like I said, he has a more scholarly viewpoint on these, but I'm going to be here to answer questions for people, or maybe answer questions for Lynn or Lauren. And Lynn, you can take it away.
Wonderful. Well, good evening, good afternoon, everyone. It's really wonderful to see you. It's really an honor to be here. Thanks to Lauren for the invitation, and it's just really wonderful to share the screen, or the stage, I guess it is, with Paula Peters, someone I've known for quite some time now, and we've co-presented in different contexts. And I just always appreciate her perspective, her research, her insights, and the work that she's done to educate the broader community as well. And so one of the things that she has done that we've used at Brown as well is this Our Story exhibit, which, Paula, I don't know that you really talked a whole lot about that at length, but this is a traveling exhibition that goes around to sort of describe some of this history, to educate people about this early history of the Wampanoag people, which is really terrific. So I'm going to share my screen here, and then we can go ahead and get started. So can everyone see the PowerPoint slide okay? I am assuming so, unless there's frantic messaging in the chat that you can't see it. So part of what I want to do today is just to step back a little bit, building upon Paula's really fantastic sort of build up to the initial points of colonization, right? So we think that 1620, as Paula was saying, is sort of the beginning, but actually there's a lot of this prehistory from the perspective of indigenous communities that were here. 1620 is not really the beginning. It's just one of a series of points of intrusions, of invasions, of different kinds of points of contact. And that's a really important, just fundamental point that I want to build upon to show what happens after that point as well. To step back, to think about the many ways in which this issue of indigenous enslavement, this activity of Native American slave trading, persisted within the English colonies, both in North America and also in the Caribbean and in between those two places, as well as in the United States up until actually past the American Civil War in the 19th century. And the reason why I think it's important to get both of these stories is because there's this prehistory that's not really talked about very much. And then if indigenous enslavement is mentioned in history books or in sort of local retelling of experiences and local history, it's often Spanish conquistadores who are doing this. It's Columbus, which I think is exactly right, but it's not actually the whole story. What I have been finding in my own research for this book I'm writing, as well as for this project I'm working on, which I'll share a bit about later on, is this long-term experience of Native Americans of being enslaved and also being dispossessed simultaneously. So it starts before official English colonization begins in 1607. It starts before that, or 1620 here in New England. But it also continues well into the United States in the 19th century in ways that I personally found really jarring and surprising. For Native people, this is not news, but this is something I think that we need to do more with as a nation, as non-natives, to reckon with this history and to think about the way in which this has had a long effect on Native communities. So my presentation this afternoon really is looking to make three main points. They're very basic, I know, but I hope to sort of flesh this out a little bit. First of all, that indigenous slavery was much more prevalent than we usually realize. Approximately between 2 and 5.5 million indigenous peoples were enslaved in the Americas as a whole, so North, Central, and South America and the Caribbean, between 1492, I'm sorry, it's a misprint there, and 1880. And that's compared to the roughly between 10 and 12.5 million enslaved Africans that were brought from Africa in the same time period. So we're talking about really large numbers. I mean, these are estimates, but my suspicion is as we know more, those numbers will actually increase in terms of the number of enslaved indigenous people. That's what happened with this African slave trade too. The more research that was done, the more we begin to adjust our numbers upward. So the second main point is that the histories of indigenous slavery and African slavery are really interrelated. I'm not going to linger a lot on this point, but I don't see these as necessarily separate slaveries entirely. They were distinct for reasons I'll talk about in a minute, but they were also increasingly overlapping because of the intermarriage that took place between African and Indian peoples over time. And so you see this reflected in some of the advertisements for sale or self-emancipated runaway slave ads. You find people of mixed race that are mentioned, and there's something more pernicious behind that as well, because it was also part of a general sort of erasure of indigenous identity over time too. But these histories are interrelated. That's my second main point. And then the third main point, again, very basic, but the reality of indigenous slavery forces us to rethink the foundations of colonization. That is to say, we think about enslavement through the lens of labor, and that's because we've been attuned to the transatlantic African slave trade, which is exactly right. But there's an additional dynamic when we talk about Native American slavery, because there's also the process of dispossessing natives, of taking their lands when you're enslaving indigenous families, when you're enslaving indigenous people, when you're taking the men and shipping them off to the Caribbean, when you're enslaving women locally, when you're separating women from their mothers from their children, you're destabilizing family units, you're destabilizing communities, and you also are eventually clearing up land for colonial settlements. So this intertwining of enslavement and dispossession, I think is really central to the success, if we could call it that, of colonization in a way that we haven't really fully reckoned with. So that's kind of where we're heading, and I look forward to the Q&A to talk more about this over time too. So to start, I often start with a wider sort of Atlantic background that includes Columbus and the Spanish, but I'm going to jump more directly to the English to tell the sort of post-1620 story of this, as Paula very nicely summarized. This early sort of Spanish invasion of 1492 from the very first year included a lot of chatter, a lot of talk, but also a lot of action, direct enslavement of natives, shipping them back to Spain. And Columbus actually proposes this to the King and Queen of Spain as a commercial enterprise to pay for colonization. Columbus had been was familiar with the African slave trade, such as it existed at that time, from the coast of West Africa up to we call the near Atlantic islands, the Madeiras, the Azores, and so forth. He had seen that in action. He had been on a ship that was there. And so he used this as a model for trying to understand the way that enslaved Indians, as he called them, because he thought he had reached the, sort of the Asia, essentially, to enslave local indigenous people as a part of funding colonization. So from the beginning, this is embedded into sort of the way that natives are treated or viewed or monetized potentially in a way. And that continues on throughout the 16th century. A lot of debates back and forth about how natives should be treated within the Spanish Empire. The Portuguese are part of this process as well. But just to say that this isn't something that was sort of a second thought with colonization. This is actually sort of, as I said, baked into the very sort of mentality of European colonization, is the not just the mistreatment of natives, but specifically the enslavement of them. We talk about the English then. I'm not going to get into this because Paula covered this very nicely. But this is actually something we see repeatedly, as Paula said. Almost every time a European ship, comes anywhere on the coast of North America or anywhere in the Americas, they're nabbing natives, or kidnapping them. They're taking them back to sell as slaves. So this is a very important part of this first contact. I do have in here, I just want to highlight, because Paula didn't show it, this Our Story exhibit, which I think is just such a fantastic visual representation and storytelling of this early history. So if you're interested, I think it's still traveling around, Paula, right? This is something that people could perhaps still hire and still get into their community.
Yeah, it is still traveling, and it is presently at a museum on the Cape, and I'm gonna double check what that place is, and I'll make sure that I follow up at the end, but I think it's in Dennis.
Wonderful. Well worth seeing for sure. And thanks for that service to all of us through that too. So I thought what I would do, since we don't have tons of time, is for me to step back and think about some of the trends in Native American enslavement as a way to sort of think through the bigger picture with all of you. So as we think about from, 1607, 1620, pick your start date, 1602. I know Cape Cod really latches on that date as well. Up through the American Civil War, 1865, 1867, which is an important date I'll get to in a minute. There are several trends we can see over time. So let me just kind of walk through those as a way of starting the conversation. So in the colonial period, and I recognize that the colonial period is a perspectival term. Historians use it to mean up until the American War of Independence, but for Native Americans, this is still the colonial period. I just want to recognize that. So by this, I mean sort of the English period, colonization up to the American Civil War. One of the early ways that we see in Native Americans being enslaved is through different kinds of privateering activity of shipping and piracy in the Atlantic, in the Caribbean, between different colonies. And so we tend to focus on the early colonies of Virginia and Plymouth and Massachusetts. And that's okay in Plymouth, as I mentioned, but also it's important to realize that from a perspective from London, a perspective of merchants, they're probably more interested in the Caribbean because that's where the Spanish are. And so one of the early activities that they really engaged in was taking over Spanish and Portuguese ships that were full of enslaved Africans or enslaved Native peoples from time to time as well. And this was really central to the way the English thought about themselves. They weren't just focused on North America. By the time Boston was founded in 1630, for example, the English had also set up or tried to set up at least 9 colonies in the Caribbean, Guyana, Barbados, Bermuda, Antigua, and so forth. So the Caribbean is really central for the way the English think about themselves in the 16 teens, 20s, and 30s especially. So English privateers between 1570 and 1700 especially target these Spanish and Portuguese and French ships. They circle the Caribbean, they sack a Spanish or Portuguese ship, they take the enslaved Africans and natives that are on it, and then they bring them back to sell at their own colonial ports of Bermuda, Virginia, Boston, wherever. So just one example of this, well, this is a visual depiction, right? So that these privateers are kind of circling the Caribbean and then bring them back to North America for sale. So there's a few small examples of this. I won't go into a lot of detail, but just as one example, in 1645, a privateer named Bartholomew Preston arrived in Bermuda and sold 40 enslaved natives that he had taken during a raid against the Spanish from some unknown location in the Caribbean. So he sold them all to Bermuda planters, and there's documentation for this in Bermuda. It's very clear what happened. And they joined then at that time the larger African workforce in the island as well. But sometimes there were really big shipments. In 1671, Sir Henry Morgan captured 1,000 enslaved Africans and natives from Spanish Panama and sold them to different places. 1683, Captain Van Horn did the same from Veracruz, excuse me. So the result then is that you have over time this sort of slow entry of enslaved natives from the Caribbean through English traders and privateers up into the American colonies that we know, Bermuda, Plymouth, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and so forth. One famous example of this is in 1681, the esteemed Boston minister Cotton Mather gave his father, Increase Mather, who ended up being the president of Harvard for a while, a gift of a Spanish Indian slave. And where did this Indian slave come from? Well, it's part of this sort of network of privateering and forced relocation, forced sale of enslaved natives from the Caribbean. So that's one trend that we see, and this persists. Really, the peak, I think, is in the 17th century. It persists into the 18th century as well, but it really is observable in the records and is something that we often think about very much. The second means or trend in the enslavement of natives is enslavement through warfare. And undergirding a lot of colonial warfare, as you probably know, especially when it involves natives, was just war theory that dates back to really the 4th century with St. Augustine, this sort of Christian thinker and philosopher. But the idea was if a war was justified, basically any means, not any means, but that seemed to be the case, that once it was justified, then you had certain rights, right? And one of the rights was the captor could enslave those they were fighting against. And so using just war theory as a means to sort of justify enslavement of natives was actually something that happened very, very quickly, starting in the 1630s with the Pequot War, 1636, 1638, fought mostly in Connecticut, what's now Connecticut, against the Pequot Nation. Then also King Philip's War, 1675, 1676 as well. Both of these, which I'll just speak about in a second, represent these noticeable peaks in New England of upticks in Native American enslavement. So the Pequot War, as you probably know, was against the Pequot Nation. It ended up, really one of the pinnacles of this, one of the peaks of this was the sort of massacre and burning of the fort at Mystic. Approximately 500 natives were killed, Pequots mostly, men, women, and children, where the English and their native allies surround the fort, set fire to it, and shoot anyone that tried to come out, and then capture a lot of other natives who were still left. So after the Pequot War, the English colonists sold as many as 200 to 300 Pequot captives locally as slaves, and also shipped them off to different parts of the Caribbean, including, at least one attempt that was made to Bermuda, but ends up going to Providence Island off the coast of Nicaragua and Honduras today. That same shipment, by the way, Captain Pierce out of Salem, that sent 17 Pequot captives down to Providence Island, Captain Pierce also exchanged them for tobacco and cotton and enslaved Africans and brought them back in 1638 and sold them in Boston, one of the first official sales of enslaved Africans in New England this time period. King Philip's War is fought under different kinds of pretenses or auspices, I guess, in a way. The Pequot War in the 1630s, one could truly say was a genocidal war against the Pequots, really an attempt to exterminate them as a people, to disperse them. Part of the treaty in 1638, the Hartford Treaty, you couldn't even use the name Pequot. Even the very name of Pequot was attempted to be exterminated. The dynamics in King Philip's War are slightly different in a way. This is after 20, 30, 40 years of colonization. There's this continual pressure on Wampanoag, on the Narragansett, Nipmuc, and so forth, in terms of colonial restrictions, of land loss, of chipping away at sovereignty of local indigenous nations and tribes, that leads to this eruption of conflict. And it's devastating for everyone involved, but especially for natives. The 5,000 natives are killed, 2,500 colonists are killed as well, but at least another 1,000 natives are enslaved. Some of them are enslaved locally, others of them are sent out into the Caribbean in different kinds of ways. And the trend in this sort of post-warfare experience is that typically the women and children are enslaved locally. This happened in the Pequot War as well. And the men, because they're it's afraid, the colonists were afraid that they would sort of run away and enact retribution against them, they were actually either killed, often in the town square. There was a lot of Native men who were identified as being actively in rebellion were killed in the Boston Common. Also, the same is true that happened in other colonies as well. But a lot of men who weren't killed were sent away as slaves to other parts of North America, the Caribbean, and even parts of Europe, and in some cases, Northern Africa too. So this map here is a map of the different places that in the 17th century that we know that North American natives were sent as slaves. So again, you see Mexico. I found an account of New England natives who get shipped to Mexico after King Philip's War. And the reason why someone noted them is because they actually rose up against their master, killed him, and ran away, trying to make their way back to New England. So Mexico, Jamaica, Curacao, which is a Dutch colony, Barbados, Antigua, Martinique, the Martinique natives, and St. Lucia natives are coming from New France, actually. Bermuda, the Azores, Tangier, Cadiz, Spain. This is actually, again, the hidden part of this history is like this shipment out, this almost reverse middle passage of sending natives out from North America as slaves. This slave trade out of New England and out of North America is astonishing. And as part of this process, one shipment of enslaved New England natives was actually sent to Tangier, which for a time was an English outpost in North Africa, what's now Morocco. And we have this document from 1676, right during the middle of King Philip's War, that there was a shipment of enslaved people that were sent to Tangier, and 10 of them were natives, presumably from New England in this time period. And we have other evidence that they get sent there as well. In fact, one of the British Admiralty captains wrote to a contact in New England asking, after he had received some New England natives as slaves for his galley ship, he actually asked if maybe every year a shipment of New England natives could be sent to him to help row his ships. So there's lots of different ways that we know this was happening. Another trend in the enslavement of natives during the colonial period is large-scale Indian slave trade. And again, I think this is something that scholars are beginning to know more and more about. But the wider public, I think, hasn't really become fully aware of this, and it's really regionally based. So, these enslavements and shipping out from New England was really astonishing and significant and disruptive and damaging and horrible. But it never reached sort of the numbers and level that it did in other parts of the Americas and within the English Empire, at least. And that's not just to minimize what was happening in New England at all, but just to say that it was even worse other places and looked different for different kinds of reasons. So the two places that people really point to that scholars have been looking at are the Carolinas between 1680 and 1720, where between 25,000 and 51,000 natives were enslaved and shipped out of the colony. The records aren't super complete, so these are estimates by scholars. Then also the Mosquito Shore, which is down here on the coast of Central America, what is now Honduras and Nicaragua. And Providence Island is one of these islands out here too, which I mentioned earlier. There was an active Native American slave trade off the coast of the Mosquito Shore for about 100 years, between 1670 and 1770 as well. And so during the Carolinas, during this whole process in the Carolinas, by the way, if you're interested in this, a scholar named Alan Gillay has written a fascinating book called The Indian Slave Trade about the slave trade. But there was a process whereby sort of natives that were allied with the English would slave raid other natives in the interior and also down into Florida, Spanish Florida, and bring them back to Charlestown, where the English would buy them and sell them as slaves or trade them for different kinds of resources and then sell them as slaves. So we have this active slave trade out of the Carolinas. In the Mosquito Shore, it looks slightly different, but very similar in some ways as well. You have the English come to the Mosquito Shore and basically demand enslaved natives from the Mosquito Indians, and then the Mosquitoes go off and slave raid and then come back and give those enslaved natives to the English, who then take them and sell them off to other parts of the English Empire as a part of a pattern of trade. So the Mosquitoes are looking for certain kinds of trade items from the English, and to get them, they bring them enslaved natives. But another thing that's kind of interesting in my research, I've noted that often enslaving missions and turtling missions go hand in hand. So the Mosquitoes would go out on sort of turtle hunts, but as a part of that process, they would also then stop and slave raid Spanish mission towns into the interior and bring both turtles and enslaved Native Americans back to the English to trade for other kinds of manufactured goods. The turtle trade was really vibrant. The shells of green turtles and also other kinds of turtles, hawksbill turtles, were used to make different kinds of handles for combs and stuff like that, for pins, for hairbrushes and stuff like that. And also turtle soup was really popular too. So these two things were in high demand within the English Empire. And the Mosquito Indians sort of played the role that coastal African kingdoms did in the African slave trade, whereby they would sort of, slavery to the interior in Africa and bring out enslaved Africans to sell to the English. And the Mosquitoes played that role in Central America, slave raiding to the interior and bringing back enslaved natives. There's all kinds of complicated questions we can ask about why the Mosquitoes would do that, which I'm happy to entertain. But I think that the point really here is this is all driven by colonialism itself, the presence of the English, the presence of trade goods to exchange, the presence of different kinds of colonial pressures, of antagonism between the English and the Spanish. This is part of what drives these slave trades in different kinds of ways. What I think is interesting and really sad to think about too is the way in which these natives from the Mosquito Shore Indian slave trade, as well as the Carolina slave trade, were sent all over the Caribbean basin, but also up into North America as well. So this explains why Cotton Mather has a Native American from Spanish, Americas in a way to sell it all. This privateering activity could have been from the Mosquito Shore, could have been from anywhere really. We just don't know because they weren't keeping good track of the records. But just one example, in 1767, an enslaved Indian named Jack ran away from his master in New Jersey. And we know this because Jack's master printed a runaway slave ad in the local newspaper. And so we can see what he wrote about him. So Jack's master described Jack in quite detail in this runaway slave ad. He said he was 5 feet 6 inches tall, 21 years old, had long black hair in a ponytail, and could play a fiddle. And Jack was specifically described as a Mosquito Shore Indian in this, meaning that he was a part of this slave trade that had been shipped off the Mosquito Shore, probably through Jamaica, and then up into New Jersey in the 1760s. So again, it's important to realize that these experiences were multiplied by the thousands of natives in North America, the Caribbean, South America, were captured, displaced, forcibly transported, and sold as slaves in a way that really, in some kind of ways, mirrors the African slave trade. It's also important to think about a fourth way that natives were enslaved, and this is through what one scholar has called judicial enslavement. That is to say, enslavement as punishment for crimes. So just one example, in 1678, 3 native men on Cape Cod were accused of breaking and entering into a colonist's house. And as punishment, the local court ordered them to be sold as perpetual slaves. That's the terminology in the court records. Perpetual slaves to pay for the items they had stolen. So it's a pretty harsh punishment, right? And just another way in which Native Americans were forced into slavery in this time period in different ways. But Native Americans could also be forced into slavery, sometimes for short term, sometimes for their entire life, if they couldn't pay back debts. So there's a whole history of local merchants running up debts intentionally against Native Americans. So luring natives into overspending essentially, and then using the local court system to enslave them if they couldn't pay their debt. There's also other kinds of more blurry situations like court-ordered indenture, where you had either voluntary parental indenture of their own children, or maybe, if there was some sort of situation where local courts would forcibly take the child away from the parents and put them out into a white family. But once the child was away from the family, from the native family, it's very easy to take them across colony lines and sell them as a lifelong slave or something like that, right? So a lot of native children end up in the Native American slave trade through this kind of indenture system over time. Another way in which this happens, in which natives were enslaved, is through the bounty system. So as early as King Philip's War, if not even earlier, local governments often specifically contracted mercenaries to come in and put high bounties on the heads of natives if they brought in native heads or scalps, or if they brought them in alive as captives to be sold as slaves, they were actually even paid more. And so every single war from the 1670s at least, up through the American Revolution, you find local governments putting out notices of bounties for natives, either as, in the form of scalps, like I said, for a lower price most of the time, or if you bring them in, if you brought them as a captive to be sold as a slave, they're much higher. There's one example of this during the American Revolution, where I think it was North Carolina had officially published a bounty system and offered a certain amount of money. In this case, they said that if soldiers took natives as captives, they could sell them as slaves and keep the money. And so in this particular case, Captain William Moore's campaign against the Cherokees, his men took some Cherokee individuals captive and then wanted to sell them as slaves. And William Moore at first resisted. And then the men said, well, look, if you don't let us sell them as slaves, we'll just kill them on the spot and hand in their scalps for the bounty. And so William and Moore sort of backed off and let them sell them as slaves. So again, this is not a huge part of the American Revolution, but like the persistence of the mentality of enslaving, of capturing, of killing off natives is just astonishing when you see it over and over and over again. By 1770, there's a recognition that a slow recognition, I would say, that relative to Africans, natives should not be enslaved, and it's a complicated series of legal progressions that lead to that point, um, uh, which I don't think I have time to get into. But basically, there's a view of natives that they are sort of originally independent and free, but somehow in the process of declaring them free and independent, also made them, from the federal government's recognition standpoint, made them less able to retain their land. So there was a transaction there that, you know, benefited natives in terms of that sort of new colonial mentality with the United States, that they were not enslavable, but then also that they were not capable of keeping their lands. That was the trade-off in this time period, in a complicated way. So what we have then, starting from the 1770s, is a lot of different kinds of native freedom suits, where natives basically go to the local courts and say, my grandmother was wrongfully enslaved. She was a free white native. She should not have been enslaved. And then over time, the courts begin to be more and more sympathetic to this line of argument and free um, hundreds and hundreds of natives over time. And we have these court cases. Actually, some of them go quite late. The latest Supreme Court case I found, the US Supreme Court case, is I think from the 1830s, whereby a Native American freedom suit makes its way to the US Supreme Court, and the person receives their freedom, which is quite astonishing as well. But there's a lot of these cases that I could mention or talk about. Just one example, in the early 19th century, there was a collection of enslaved people of indigenous descent who went to the local courts in Virginia and said, our mother was wrongfully enslaved in the 1720s, and therefore we should be free, we should be set free. And so it went to the Supreme Court of Virginia, who did their due diligence, took depositions, traced the lineage back to the original maternal ancestor, whose name was Papoose, and found out that she had been sold she was an indigenous woman who had been sold as a slave from from Jamaica to Virginia in the 1720s, and then had a bunch of children, then grandchildren over time. And so it was these grandchildren who were claiming their freedom based upon their mother's wrongful enslavement. So this is just one of dozens and dozens and dozens of court cases that try to sort through this history of enslavement in the late 18th and early 19th century. So there's more I could say as well, but just one final thing to sort of highlight is that you have a whole additional kind of situation that emerges in the American West as the United States began to sort of colonize that part of the country as well, because there had been an older practice of Spanish slavery in the American Southwest and what's now New Mexico and Utah and California. And the Americans came in and just continued that in many ways. And so you have a lot of different court cases, a lot of different freedom suits in the American Southwest and New Mexico, Utah, and California. If you know anything about the history of California, there were whole ranches in California in the 1840s, 1850s, or the 1850s, 1860s, that were almost entirely run by enslaved or coerced natives in different kinds of ways, even though California was admitted as a free state. It's this really ironic kind of situation where coerced and enslaved native labor wasn't seen really as slavery in the same way that African slavery was, even though people on the ground treated them the same, bought and sold them the same way, and everything else. And actually, everyone's familiar with the 13th Amendment, which is at the end of the American Civil War, is what formally sort of ends Black slavery in the US. But actually, there's a whole congressional investigation into New Mexico, into California in the mid-1860s to try to understand why it is that Native Americans are still being held in bondage or in peonage after the 13th Amendment. And so Congress has to pass a whole new amendment in 1867 that formally frees and prohibits, frees natives held under peonage and prohibits peonage everywhere in the United States. So again, this history has a very, very long shadow. It's not just Columbus, it's not just Ipanau, which is really an important foundational moment, but this history that it never goes away. You just find the enslavement of natives, the coercion of native labor, the mistreatment of natives, and also alongside of that, as a part of it, sort of the taking of land of natives repeatedly over time. And so just two more things to end. I know we're running out of time and I've gone a bit long maybe, is to think about this question, how is it that we could have missed native enslavement for so long? And there's many different kinds of reasons, but one of them is just the simple record keeping that was taking place that really was sort of writing natives out of existence. So one example of this is a 1698 census in Bermuda. And you can see here, there's no natives mentioned. Like this is the entire census here. Number of whites, number of blacks, no natives, right? But the same time period, we have a lot of probate records that list Indian men and women as slaves on estates in Bermuda. And in this case, this is the inventory of Boaz Sharp's Bermuda plantation that only has Native American slaves in his possession. There's no African slaves at all. So we know that there's record keeping that was really imprecise and incorrect. But also this idea that governments and individuals are shifting people's races over time to hide the presence of native slaves in different kinds of ways. And there's examples of this I could give as well, where you have one individual is mentioned to be native in one context, and then Negro or Black or mulatto in a different context. People who are called mulatto, but then are also, it says they have long black hair, right? Which is a very, very, very Indian trait as well. And then also, I think there's this broader context of the US just not adequately dealing with Native presence. This is partly why historians have missed this for so long, why the wider public doesn't really know about it. But natives have known, Native communities and tribes and nations. This is not news to them. And I think that there's a way in which we need to sort of figure out how to reinsert some of this hard but really important history of colonialism and its effects up until the present in our teaching of US history in different kinds of ways. I just wanted to mention briefly this project that Lauren mentioned, the Stolen Relations, Recovering Stories of Indigenous Enslavement in the Americas. This is a community-centered project that is based out of Brown University, but is collaborating with tribal representatives from between 12 and 13 Native communities and tribes in New England. And the purpose really is to provide a centralized place to recover the stories of individual natives who had been caught up in this sort of colonial process of enslavement. And so I can stop sharing and resharing quickly just to show you what we're up to very, very, very quickly, to give you a sense of what we're doing. So this is not public yet, but we're working with our tribal collaborators to develop this database. Basically, we are trying to rehumanize people from the documents by giving them a full, biographical sentence. There's details in here about each individual record. Let me show you a different one because there's document images that come with each one of these as well for most of them that give the actual runaway slave ad or self-emancipated ad as well. So this project is ongoing. We have, several thousand individuals in here, but the hope is over time, as we can bring these people out of these colonial documents and involve local tribes and natives in understanding and interpreting and presenting these to the wider public, that we can make this process of indigenous enslavement and dispossession more central to our understanding of the colonial period and settler colonialism that was so devastating. And as Paula said, resonates to today. I mean, it's only in 2002 that indigenous people in New England and Bermuda began to undo these legacies of settler colonialism and enslavement by reconnecting across space and time and reconnecting families. So I think that's it. I'm out of time. Thanks for your attention for sure. And I know that Paul and I would love to entertain any questions you have as well. So back to you, Lauren.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you, Paula. That was wonderful. I learned a lot. That was fantastic. I'm very impressed by Stolen Relations. What a terrific project that you have spearheaded. We do have our first question from Ron Fickner, which is, what's known about the descendants of the indigenous people who early on were sent to Europe? Did any of their culture endure?
Yeah, Paula, do you have any sense of this? I mean, usually people simply disappear into this sort of vast European landscape.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not aware of anyone enduring culturally in Europe or England. I mean, there are some records of Native people arriving at certain ports and then becoming more, they're anglicized, I guess. And because there is no cultural connection there, I don't think there's much of an opportunity for them to have endured as, you know, in a cultural way. Mm-hmm. So we learn more about those who actually returned, like Squanto and Ipanau, but we don't have any record. And the record keeping is, as Lynn described, it's very poor. You don't really learn much about what happened to those 27 men who were delivered to Spain back in 1614. We know that some of them were rescued, be that as it may, from by the religious order that intervened in that slave trade. But beyond that, we really don't know what happened to them. As a matter of fact, we can't be sure whether Squanto himself was one of those that was rescued by the religious order, or did he actually become sold and in that way end up in England and then ultimately coming back. So the record keeping on these people who were sold into slavery is not very good.
And I would only add that the track record of the natives we do know who were shipped over the course of, you know, several hundred years is that they don't tend to survive European diseases very easily. And so almost all of them, I'm trying to think of a single one that we know of that lives in any part of Europe for any period of time and survives European diseases. There's a bunch that are sent back. There's a few famous examples that the French send some over for sort of cultural education and then sent back. But I would be really surprised if there's any that persist long term and have that ability to have cultural sort of survivance in that context. But I could be wrong.
Another comment and then a question from Helen McNeil Ashton, who says, in Truro, 7 families owned at least 18 slaves in the colonial period, but described them as servants. What are your thoughts on the shifting boundaries between indentured labor and chattel slavery in New England? Was there an understanding in the 18th century about what these practices meant?
Yeah, Paula, do you have any insights? A few comments.
You know, no, not really. I think that, you know, the sensibilities here in New England, and it was similar too, I know, in Bermuda, where they didn't like to use the term slave, but if you're indentured and you're indentured for the rest of your life, I mean, what else are you but a slave? New Englanders like to point to the South and say, well, that's where slavery existed. And I found it similar when I did visit Bermuda and tried to get information on slaves, and they wanted to deny that really was the case. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't surprise me that that there isn't a whole lot of acknowledgement. And I guess I would pass that to Lynn. I mean, what do you find in your research?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the question's a really good one. And so several things, just to follow up on the Bermuda thing, I agree with you that both in New England and Bermuda, because they're both Puritan colonies, essentially, or Puritan-dominated colonies. Bermuda wasn't only Puritan, it was Anglican too. But there's a lot of Puritans of Bermuda and Barbados as well. They shied away from calling their enslaved people slaves. They called them servants. And so this is what this question is getting at. What is that slippery line? And in Bermuda, the deeds of sale we have, not all of them, but a lot of them say that, Indian John is sold to whatever, Harry, Sam, for the period of 80 years, or so long as the slave or the servant should live. And I don't know if you can do your math, but 80 is 80, 19 is 19 years, obviously, so 99 years. So these were people being sold as servants, just like Paul was saying, for 99 years, right? This is a window into this mentality. The English were sort of guilt-stricken in a way about enacting slavery at some level. There's some sort of deep sort of aversion to it, but they did it. Obviously, they just called it by different means. I have another example from Jamaica where the Board of Trade and Plantations was reviewing the laws of Jamaica. I think, again, this is the late 17th, early 18th century. And they noticed the word slave in the laws, and they write to the Jamaica proprietors and say, we saw that you use the word slave. Could you use the word servant instead? Because people have a negative association with slavery. So yes, they are aware of these distinctions. They don't want to be the Spanish. They don't want to, be the bad people. But there's a functional slavery, even in this sort of term of servitude. And if you look at Oxford English Dictionary Online, for example, it kind of gives some sense of the slippage between these two terms. So one thing we've tried to do with our database project is to try to include every form of coercion because the line is so slippery. So even if it says servant, we look for contextual clues. We include them in the database because it almost always involves some sort of coercion as well. And I don't know. So the question at the end of Helen's question was about the Mass Supreme Court's case in 1805. And I'm not familiar with this, honestly, but I think this is part of that transition period that I was talking about earlier, where natives are beginning to be seen in a different light. By this time, almost all the New England colonies had enacted different kinds of gradual emancipation acts, for example. So slavery itself is starting to be phased out. And as a part of that, there's a lot of coerced labor that is being looked upon in a negative light. What I will say, though, is that there's a lot of newspaper advertisements for runaway indentured natives in the early 19th century. So it's very, very common. So is this a part of a shift in verbiage from servant/slave to indenture, or is there something else going on? I don't know yet. I know we've just tabulated this for the database project, and we haven't really fully interpreted that process yet.
Interesting. Were natives from Cape Cod enslaved?
Lynn talked a little bit about what happened after King Philip's War, and that you were either deemed, and after any of the native wars, mm-hmm. you were either deemed a threat and either killed or sold off into slavery, or you had to show that you weren't a threat by becoming praying Indians. So praying Indians towns were established all over the region. And it certainly, I mean, it became a way for Native people to protect themselves under the cloak of Christianity. Mm-hmm. So could you become enslaved? Absolutely. By the methods that Lynn was talking about, you know, if you broke the law, if you, you know, if you didn't pay your debt, that debt could be translated into indentured servitude, which was, you know, oftentimes just an unreasonably long period of time, and went far beyond just the repayment of a debt. And, you know, it would sometimes be not yourself, but your children that would be taken and be put into this indentured servitude. So I would say yes. And I know that Jessie Littledoe has done some research as well, where she's been able to see where some of this did take place. And it wasn't just the indentured servitude, it was also about land. That's one of the ways that the Mashpee people lost land, was by being enticed into these unreasonable mortgage situations where someone would come and say, well, I'm going to give you $50 and you just let me hold on to this piece of this title to your land. And of course, they didn't understand what a mortgage was. They didn't understand the interest on the debt. They didn't understand any of that. So soon enough, that piece of land then belonged to the mortgage holder. Right. So there were all kinds of ways of duping Native people. And yeah, that's, I guess that's textbook colonization. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Another question from Fran Adams. Do the Europeans who made early contact with the Native Americans believe that they're fully human? And she also goes on to ask, were there any Europeans who expressed qualms about enslaving Native people?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that there are a lot of instances where you will find in their writings that they justify the treatment of Indigenous people and the atrocities, really, by dehumanizing people. And, you know, that was easy enough to do because of the doctrine of discovery and papal bulls that described anyone who didn't adhere to these religious texts, then they were themselves savages and brutish. And yeah, you'll find many quotes in the journals of the Pilgrims. William Bradford himself, who he just considered them to be brutish and savage and just unworthy people, until, of course, that's what he said before the Mayflower arrived, until he realized that he needed to depend upon these people to survive mm-hmm. himself. Mm-hmm. And then his language softened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's really, it's a complicated question. I think I would say that the fully human or other than human is kind of a false binary in a way, because in the thinking of the early modern period, there's like all these different cultural gradations, and you can justify a lot of mistreatment for humans who are still human, but very people you deem to be inferior to you, right? I think that's kind of the context we're in. But the second question you're asking, any qualms about enslaving natives? Yes, the answer is yes. There's a lot of people who are speaking out against this all the time, also asking questions about African slavery too. And as I tell my students, it's if you can find one person who questions this, then I think we have the sort of ability to step in and say, they knew better. Like, we can't just say, oh, that was just what they did back then. People back then were also asking questions. So one of the famous cases in the 16th century with the Spanish, where you have essentially two different groups, two different factions that form in the royal court about the treatment of natives. And you have Bartolome de las Casas on the one hand, and this guy Sepulveda on the other hand, and they really go at it in the courts. And, you know, the Spanish crown is so taken by de las Casas' description of the mistreatment of the natives that he had published. So that in 1542, there's a series of new laws that are passed in an attempt to curb the abuses against Indigenous people. It doesn't have the effect that they want, of course, but this is a really clear recognition and a debate, a public debate, a legal debate about the treatment of natives. You have some of this in New England as well during King Philip's War, the missionary to Native Americans to Massachusetts, natives especially, but actually more regionally too. John Eliot, who was a local pastor, writes to basically a protest letter and says, look, we shouldn't be enslaving natives who are coming to us for mercy, right? So he's protesting the sale of what they call the surrenders, of natives who aren't actively in so-called rebellion, but surrender themselves to local governments for mercy, and local governments were selling them into slavery too. And so John Eliot protests that particular practice. So yeah, there's all these voices. The Quakers over time become a main presence against African slavery more generally too, but it's a really great question. And I think that there were people who had
qualms. Can I follow up, Lauren? Earlier in our discussion, someone had asked about where the exhibit, the Our Story exhibit is right now. And it is at the Cape Cod Museum of Art, which I believe is in Dennis. And it is in its, we were unable during COVID to really get it out there. So it's receiving somewhat of a revival. And I believe that there will be some other places where it'll be exhibited once we finish with this run. I believe it's going to be at Cape Cod Museum of Art for another several weeks anyway. So if someone wants to see it, it's there. And you can also check it out online. I believe some of the videos are available if you go to the Plymouth 400 website. I'd be happy to share links if anyone is interested.
And I want to say that I went down to the Cape Cod Museum of Art 2 weeks ago and saw it, and it was really terrific. So thank you, Paula, for mentioning that. I would encourage anyone who can to get down there to take a look at that exhibition. It's fabulous. One final question before we close this out. Did Native American tribes forced to leave their homes and move west bring enslaved Africans with them?
You mean from Cape Cod?
The question doesn't specify from what location. The question was, did Native American tribes who were forced to leave their homes and move west bring enslaved Africans with them?
I imagine the context is southeastern removal in the 1830s. So the Cherokees, Chickasaws, who were forced at gunpoint by the U.S. military, to move from Georgia and other places to Oklahoma. The answer is yes. Not all Native families, not all Native communities practice the enslavement of Africans. I think it's important to recognize that Cherokees and Chickasaws, especially, who began practicing African slavery, in a way, one way to understand it is that they were trying to blend into Southern culture to prove that they had the right to stay. And as a part of that, trying to prove they had the right to stay, they wrote their own constitution that mirrored the US Constitution. They accepted missionaries. They developed their own written language, right? They began to publish newspapers, all these things in an attempt to sort of prove to the surrounding white community that they were civilized, so-called, and therefore had the right to retain their lands, which is kind of crazy they had to go to those lengths. But scholars who've been looking at this, of course, yes, this is well known that there is sort of a long history and lineage of this, but to try to understand it through that lens, but also understand the way in which it might have been different too. So there's a lot of natives who held enslaved Africans sometimes also had family relations with them as well, or had families with them too. And so there's an intertwining of a different kind of slavery often in those contexts. It's more familial and less sort of capitalist based in a way. But yeah, it's a very complicated question that, as you probably know, continues into the present to divide some of these larger, formerly Southeastern tribes that had been forced to be removed.
Okay, and we got a comment from Christine Smith. Thank you very much. And I want to say thank you to both of you, Paula Peters and Lynn Fisher. Fabulous, thought-provoking program. I really appreciate your time and effort. Wonderful program.
Thank you.
And
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to mention thank you to everyone who has attended tonight's program. I really appreciate your support. And we, as you know, do not charge a fee to attend our webinars, and it's easy to make a donation through our website, www.trurohistoricalsociety.org. We appreciate your support in any way. So thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you all in person one day.
Thank you. Bye,
Have a
Lynn.
great
Nice
night.
to see everyone. Thanks, Lauren. Thanks for the invitation. Have
You're
a good
very
evening,
welcome.
everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.